By midnight, the fire was roaring, but the walls were turning white. The wind clawed down the mountain, whistling through cracks no eye could see. Inside, Jonas Fletcher sat by a fire so hot it warped the air, yet frost spread across his cabin walls like creeping veins of glass. His breath hung motionless in the light, freezing before it fell. The cabin was alive with contradiction, fire and ice trapped under the same roof. He'd built it himself the summer before, proud of its straight walls and packed clay seams, every log stacked by his own hand, every chink filled until the daylight vanished between the gaps. He'd thought he'd done everything right. But when the Wind River winter came down in 1834, sudden, merciless, and howling, he learned what every newcomer to the high country learns the hard way. Nature keeps no mercy for the untested. Jonas's cabin sat at 8,000 feet in the Wind River Valley. The first snow fell before the end of October, and by November, the nights hit 30 below. He'd hauled logs for weeks, chopped cords of wood until his hands bled, yet the cold still crept in, not through the door, not through the windows, but through the very bones of the walls. He would wake in the dark hours before dawn. The fire, nothing but dying embers, his breath turning silver in the gloom. Ice formed in his water bucket, 3 feet from the hearth. Every strike of his axe bought him just another few hours of warmth. The walls themselves seemed to betray him. They hoarded the cold like an enemy inside the wood. The logs sweated during the day, froze at night, and cracked open in the wind. The clay and moss chinking fell away in dusty ribbons. Even the fire betrayed him, half its heat lost through the stone chimney that touched the outer wall. He was burning the mountain just to keep from dying, and still, the cold won. He wrote later in a letter to his brother, "I think the cold lives in these walls. I can feel it breathing." It wasn't a poetic thought. It was literal truth. The cabin was bleeding warmth because it was built to fail. Every mountain man who came west from the forests of the east had done the same. Copied a design meant for mild winters and humid summers, never realizing that in the Rockies, the rules of survival rewrote themselves. Jonas was young then, 30 years old, a carpenter's apprentice turned trapper. He'd built timber frames back in Virginia, barns, mills, simple homes that breathed through pine and cedar. Out here, surrounded by lodgepole and spruce, he used the same instincts and the same mistakes. He cut logs when the sap still ran wet in summer. He left bark clinging to hold moisture and insects. He used creek clay and dried grass for chinking. The first freeze shattered it like glass. And when he built his fireplace, he placed it against the north wall, where the ground was flattest. That single choice to save labor doomed him to burn through more firewood than any man should in one winter. By February, Jonas's back was bent from swinging the axe, his hands raw, his food dwindling. He'd begun to dream of warmth the way starving men dream of bread. But the strangest thing happened when spring returned. His cabin, which had been too cold to sleep in all winter, turned into an oven. The same thick log walls that bled away heat in January now trapped every ounce of summer warmth. By nightfall, the air inside pressed down like a furnace. He would lie awake, shirtless on the floor, listening to the creak of wood swelling in the heat, wondering how the same shelter could punish him in 2 opposite ways. That question, that frustration, would become his obsession. He didn't yet know the words for it: conduction, radiation, thermal mass. But he knew the feeling of cold that crept through walls like a ghost, and the heat that suffocated under the same roof. Somewhere in that paradox lay a secret he would spend years unraveling. And one cold morning, when a stranger stopped by his cabin, a man with a Swedish accent and eyes that had seen too many winters, Jonas would finally hear the words that would change everything. "Your cabin," the man would say, "is built backwards." When the stranger appeared that winter morning, Jonas thought he was seeing a ghost. A lone figure walked out of the fog, slow, steady, wrapped in furs bleached gray with age. The man's beard was white as snowmelt foam, his eyes sharp and pale as northern ice. He carried himself like someone who had survived too many winters to fear this one. He introduced himself simply. Niels Bergstrom, trapper. His voice carried the calm of someone who didn't waste words. Jonas offered him coffee by the fire, the cabin still cold even with flames dancing. Niels looked around slowly, as though reading the place like a map. His gaze lingered on the stone hearth against the north wall, the blackened ceiling beams, the light glinting off frost on the logs. "You're cold here," Niels said finally. It wasn't a question. Jonas laughed dryly. "Colder than I've ever been. The fire burns all day, but the chill never leaves." The old trapper stood, pressing a rough hand against the inner wall. "Because your fire warms the wrong side of the mountain," he said. "Your cabin is built backwards." Jonas frowned. "Backwards?" Niels turned, crouching near the hearth. "In Sweden," he said, "we learned a long time ago how heat moves. You keep your warmth inside, thick stone, not pressed against the cold. Your fireplace should live in the center, not the edge." He tapped the wall with his knuckles. The hollow echo made Jonas wince. "Half your fire runs out through this wall every night. You are warming the wind." Jonas leaned in, puzzled. "Then how do you keep the warmth in?" The old man smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from remembering too many mistakes. "You build heat, the way you build memory. Slow and deep. You let stone hold it and give it back when the fire sleeps. And you never let cold live in your walls. Once it settles there, you'll never chase it out." The words struck Jonas harder than any hammer. He had spent months fighting the cold as if it were an enemy, never realizing he had invited it inside. His cabin wasn't protecting him. It was conspiring against him. Niels walked him through the principles with the same quiet patience he might show a son. "Warmth doesn't just rise," he said, tracing lines in the air with a soot-black finger. "It moves. It flows through wood and stone like water. Some things drink it fast. Others hold it. Your walls here, they drink the heat and pour it into the wind." Jonas stared at the fire, watching sparks dance up the chimney. "And the fix? Move the fire where the people are," Niels said simply. "Build its bones of stone thick enough to sleep warm by. Give it time to breathe. Let your cabin feed the fire, not flee from it." There was silence for a long time after that. The wind rattled the shutters, and Jonas could almost hear the cabin thinking, its timbers creaking like an old animal stirring in its sleep. When Niels finally rose to leave, he looked at Jonas and added, "You can't fight this place. You build with it, or you freeze." After he left, Jonas stood in the stillness, the fire's glow licking the walls. His mind was a storm of questions. The idea was simple, yet it overturned everything he thought he knew. Heat wasn't just fire. It was direction, rhythm, and patience. He went outside and looked back at his own cabin, smoke trailing weakly into the blue sky. For the first time, he saw it not as shelter but as a teacher, one built wrong. He didn't know it yet, but that lesson, the backward cabin, would become the foundation of everything he built for the rest of his life. The next lesson didn't come from the north. It came from the earth itself. That autumn, when the frost first silvered the meadows and the elk calls echoed down the valley, a trading party arrived at Jonas's cabin. A French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste Marot and his Shoshone wife, Morning Crow. Jonas had seen her kind of calm only once before, in the eyes of still water. She moved like someone who understood the mountain's language better than the men who tried to tame it. Her dark hair was wrapped in a strip of elk hide, her gaze sharp and patient. While Baptiste traded pelts and powder, Morning Crow wandered the perimeter of Jonas's cabin, studying it with quiet amusement. When she stepped inside, the air was still cold, the fire struggling to fill the room with heat. She laughed, a short, knowing sound that made Jonas frown. "White men build cold houses," she said in a blend of Shoshone, French, and English, the mountain's common tongue. "You make walls that breathe out warmth like an old man's dying breath." Jonas straightened, caught between pride and frustration. "Then tell me how to build one that doesn't." Morning Crow crouched by the fire, running her fingers through the dust near the hearth. "We make two skins," she said. One to keep the life inside, one to keep the death out. Between them, air that cannot move. Jonas watched as she drew lines in the dirt. Two walls, close but not touching, with a space between. Air that cannot move, she repeated, looking up. That is what keeps the cold where it belongs. He realized in that moment how different her wisdom was from Neil's. Neil's had spoken of stone, the power to hold heat. Morning Crow spoke of space, the art of trapping stillness itself. One was strength, the other patience. Together they formed balance. She stood and looked toward the hills. Our lodges are winter homes. We dig them into the earth. The cold cannot chase what is already part of the ground. She pointed toward the dirt beneath the cabin floor. You build on the skin of the mountain. We build in its flesh. Her words struck deep. Jonas had spent his whole life fighting the elements. These people, he realized, had learned to live with them. Morning Crow walked toward the doorway, pausing before she left. When the sun is high, you open the top and let the heat escape, she said. When the snow comes, you close it, and the warmth stays. The mountain will help you if you stop trying to fight it. Jonas didn't answer. He was too busy seeing his cabin in his mind, the dead space between the walls, the misplaced fire, the heat running into the wind. When Baptiste and Morning Crow rode off down the valley, their silhouettes faded into a swirl of falling snow. Jonas stood there for a long time, the sound of their horses fading, her words echoing in his head. Two skins, still air. The mountain will help you. That night he couldn't sleep. The fire still flickered, but for the first time, he saw it not as warmth, but as a clue. Niels had taught him how heat moved. Morning Crow had shown him where it belonged. Now Jonas understood what he had to do. When the mountain thawed, the narrator intones, he would rebuild from memory and instinct. When the snows melted and the valley turned green again, Jonas began to rebuild. He tore his cabin down plank by plank, stone by stone, until nothing remained but the rough scars of its foundation and a heap of wasted firewood. The land seemed to breathe again, freed from the box that had trapped its warmth. He'd spent the spring sketching in the dirt, replaying Niels's and Morning Crow's lessons, until they merged into one picture in his mind. Not a house of walls and roof, but of balance, stone and air, warmth and stillness. This time, Jonas worked slower. Every log he felled was chosen in the cold season, sap fallen low. He peeled the bark clean and stacked them off the ground to season in the wind. When he cut into the wood, it gave a hollow, dry tone, the sound of patience. He raised his cabin 2 feet above the ground, on stone piers, not resting on the mountain now, but breathing with it. Between the soil and the floor lay a quiet pocket of air that would keep the cold where it belonged. He built the floor from split puncheons, flat and heavy, sealing the seams with thin strips of bark and clay mixed with sand. Beneath it, the air moved lazily, too slow to steal heat, too still to freeze. Then came the heart of the new home, the fireplace. He laid its stones carefully, choosing flat ones for the base, river-rounded ones for the shell. This time, it stood not against a wall, but at the cabin's center, 4 feet from the north side, the mass of stone spreading into the room like a sleeping giant. As the weeks passed, that fireplace grew, layer by layer, into something almost monumental, thick, broad-shouldered, and steady. When Jonas stood before it, he saw not a simple hearth, but a kind of promise, warmth that would stay. He mixed the mortar with a pinch of lime, traded from a settlement downriver. He didn't know the chemistry. He only knew that lime made the clay hold through freeze and thaw. He packed it tight between stones until no draft could whisper through, and around it the walls rose again, but differently now. The north and west sides, where the wind bit hardest, were double layered, 2 skins of logs, 2 feet apart, with a filling of dry moss, crushed leaves, and clay. It wasn't beauty he was after, it was balance. He wasn't building against the mountain this time, he was building with it. As the cabin took shape, neighbors stopped by, trappers heading to rendezvous, settlers passing through. They laughed at his strange designs, the raised floor, the double walls. the fireplace sitting in the middle of the room. "Looks like a fort for ghosts," one said. Jonas smiled without looking up. Maybe it'll keep them warm, too. By midsummer, the cabin was nearly finished. He built narrow windows facing south to catch the low winter sun, and small vents high near the roof to let summer heat rise out when needed. The roof itself he built steep, lined with clay, and a thick mat of sod that sprouted grass by the season's end. A living roof, breathing with the mountain. It wasn't just a structure now. It was a teacher. A reflection of everything he'd learned through failure. Every cut of wood, every packed seam, carried the memory of cold nights and quiet revelations. When he finally lit the first fire in that new hearth, the sound was different. Deeper, quieter, as if the cabin itself was listening. The warmth spread slow, steady, seeping into the stone until the air itself seemed to glow. He sat beside it long into the night, watching the light flicker on the inner walls, the heat wrapping around him like an old friend. For the first time, he didn't feed the fire with desperation. He let it burn steady, then die to coals. When dawn came, the stones still glowed faintly with the memory of flame. He touched one, and it was warm, not hot, not fleeting, just steady warmth, alive, long after the fire had gone out. He had built something that remembered heat. If stories of forgotten ingenuity speak to you, subscribe to Frontier Tales of America. Here, we keep alive the lessons written in wood, stone, and endurance. Jonas didn't know yet if it would survive a true winter, but something deep in his bones told him this time would be different. The mountain was quiet that night, not in defiance, but in approval. But the true test would come when the fire died. By October, winter had returned to the Wind River Valley, sharp, white, and absolute. Snow dusted the ridgelines, the nights sank toward 30 below, and the sound of axe blows echoed through the frozen timber. But inside Jonas Fletcher's cabin, something was different. He'd lit his new fireplace just once that afternoon, a blaze of pine and spruce so bright it painted the rafters in gold. Then, when darkness fell, he let it die. The fire dwindled to coals, the coals to ash, and still, the warmth held. He sat back in his chair, boots off, hands open toward the glow-less hearth. The stones themselves radiated heat, slow, patient, alive. The air inside the cabin felt even, calm, like the pulse of a sleeping creature. For the first time since coming west, Jonas didn't have to feed the fire through the night. The warmth no longer came from the fire. It came from the room. He woke the next morning to a pale light filtering through the frosted glass, but no frost on the inner walls. His breath didn't hang in the air. The clay seams held tight. The floorboards were dry and the stone hearth still breathed a soft warmth into the space. Jonas pressed a hand to the stone. It felt alive, like the mountain's own heartbeat echoing back to him. That day, he worked outside without gloves, smiling into the cold. He could feel the cabin holding its ground, keeping warmth like a promise. By the time deep January arrived, the kind of cold that cracked water buckets and froze the ink in his pen, the cabin was still holding strong. He burned less than half the wood he'd used the winter before. He could sit by the fire and read by lamplight without shivering. He could wake before dawn and find the air still warm enough to breathe without pain. Other trappers began stopping by, drawn by rumor. They'd step inside from the snow, shaking frost from their coats, and freeze in disbelief. "Feels like a southern house in here," one said, holding his hands out to the air instead of the flames. Jonas only smiled. "Built different," he'd say. Each man left whispering about Fletcher's cabin, the one that didn't freeze. The design began spreading, first through word, then through imitation. By the next winter, there were half a dozen cabins in the valley built with double walls, each one a little variation of the same idea. Some had bigger hearths, some smaller, some with only one double wall to save effort. But all held the same principle. The fire lives inside the home, not against its edge. Jonas would visit them when the snows cleared, helping adjust the chinking, correcting the draft paths, trading tips for tobacco or tea. He didn't hoard his knowledge. Out here, survival was no man's secret. One morning, standing outside his cabin, he watched the sun strike the sod roof, frost melting from the grass and dripping like tears down the eaves. Inside, the stones glowed gently. He realized that for the first time, he wasn't just surviving the mountains. He was living with them. And as word spread further, downriver, across the passes, trappers began writing home about the mountain cabins that held their heat. Some called it magic. Others called it luck. Jonas called it learning. He had built a home that listened to the seasons. The same stones that once drank the fire now gave it back with patience. It wasn't about outsmarting the cold anymore. It was about understanding it. By the following winter, the Wind River Valley glowed like a necklace of fires. Cabins flickered warm through the frost. Small sanctuaries of stone and timber holding their own against the deep cold. The men who'd once mocked Jonas's fort for ghosts now sat in their own double-walled cabins, shaking their heads at how little wood they burned, how the frost no longer grew on the inside glass. Jonas watched it all quietly. He wasn't a man for speeches or pride. When others came asking how he'd done it, he simply knelt by their hearths, tapping stone, checking drafts, showing them how to seal the gaps where air moved too freely. He'd explain the same truths Niels and Morning Crow had taught him, but in plain frontier terms. Stone's a memory. It remembers warmth, he'd say. And still air? That's your friend. Trap it where it can't move, and it'll guard you better than a dozen fires. The valley began to change. Trappers stayed healthier through the cold months. They cut fewer trees, spent more time mending tools or carving traps instead of swinging axes from dawn to dusk. Families that had come to the mountains after the traders now had children who didn't cough through the long nights. The design evolved as it spread. A Frenchman built a fireplace dead center, heavy enough to hold warmth for 20 hours. Two brothers from Kentucky tried sod roofing and swore it made their summers cool and their winters steady. The valley became an experiment in survival shared through whispers, not patents. Jonas sometimes walked between them at night, lantern in hand, watching smoke rise from chimneys under a cold, silver moon. The glow from each window looked like the reflection of a single idea, a better way to live with the mountain. The story of his first winter, the one that froze him to the bone, was now a cautionary tale told by campfires, and the phrase "built backwards" had become a kind of joke and a lesson at once. He never claimed to invent anything. He always said the same thing when asked. I just listened. To the cold, to the stone, to people who already knew. And so, the wisdom spread, like fire passed from hearth to hearth. But even the strongest fire fades with time, and Jonas's would one day be no different. Snow buried the tracks of every man who'd learned from him. Yet what he built, the way he taught others to build, would outlast them all. Years passed, and the valley changed. The fur trade waned, the old trappers drifted away, and new settlers came with families and plows and fences. Jonas stayed longer than most, nearly 30 years. His cabin weathered every winter, its roof greening each spring with wildflowers. By then he had married Morning Crow's cousin, a quiet woman who shared his love of still mornings and long silences. They raised 3 children in that cabin, each one learning not just how to live, but how to build. His hearth became the center of their lives, not just for warmth, but for gathering. The fire was steady, its stones glowing softly through endless seasons. Sometimes Jonas would run a hand across them, as though they were an old friend's shoulder. He'd tell his children, "This is where warmth lives, not the fire, but the stone." Visitors came often, just to see the place that didn't freeze. They marveled that the walls stayed dry, that the roof grass grew even in cold months. Jonas never took credit. He told them about Niels, about Morning Crow, about the lessons he had borrowed and combined. It's not invention, he'd say. It's listening. The mountain already knows how to build. I just paid attention. When his sons grew older, they built their own cabins nearby, each one a variation on the same pattern. Double walls, raised floors, stone hearts. The valley took on a quiet rhythm, a kind of wisdom written in timber. And when strangers passed through, settlers heading farther west, surveyors tracing the new trails, They would stop to rest and leave carrying more than supplies. They carried knowledge. By the time Jonas was an old man, gray-bearded and stooped, there were cabins in Montana, Idaho, and the Oregon territories built in the same way. He'd hear it from travelers. We heard of a mountain man who built houses that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. He'd only nod, smile faintly, and say, "Then you've met the work of good teachers." When he finally left the valley in the late 1860s, moving closer to one of his sons, his cabin stood as strong as ever. For decades after, others lived there. When they, too, moved on, the roof sagged, the walls grayed, the windows broke. But the hearth, that great mass of stone, stood untouched. It outlasted every storm. Even as the logs rotted and the roof caved in, the hearth remained, a single rough monument to the warmth that once filled that valley. And though time buried it under soil and grass, it was never truly gone, because every cabin that came after, every design that learned from his mistakes, carried a piece of it forward. The fire dies. The hearth endures. If stories like this remind you that wisdom is built stone by stone, stay with Frontier Tales of America. There are more fires yet to be lit. And somewhere beneath that same wind, beneath snow and root and memory, a few old stones still hold the faintest warmth. Warmth that once began with a man who listened to the cold and learned how to build against time itself.